Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Nintendo 64 magazine Time Capsule. So what is the Nintendo 64 Time Capsule all about? Well, as a child, I was a big fan of the Nintendo 64, and each and every month I would buy a copy of Nintendo 64 magazine, and every time I'd open each and every page, it would be a chance to look at games which are coming out in the future, games being reviewed that I'd want to own, games from other parts of the world that would perhaps never be released here. What I found recently was that when I went back through my old magazines, it brought back all of those nostalgic memories, things that I used to, that feeling as a kid, of seeing a game for the first time. Back in the days when these magazines were released, the internet was still in its infancy, so the place where most people my age used to go to find out the latest game news for the Nintendo 64 was one of the many Nintendo 64 magazines. My magazine of choice was N64 magazine. As an adult, now when I go back and open up these magazines, it brings back all of those historic childhood memories, the anticipation for games that were coming out in the future, the great feeling where you just couldn't wait to get your hands on a game that they just reviewed and given a really great score to. Also, the entertainment value of going back and seeing games which were cancelled, games which were changed, seeing them go from their initial conception all the way through to that fantastic review that many games would receive. It's a great chance to look back and witness the history of the Nintendo 64. In each episode, that history will be charted from this very first episode, which will begin now. Opening the magazine for the first time, you're greeted with a huge advert for the new Star Wars games on the left-hand side, which was kind of surprising considering that the Super Nintendo was pretty much finished by this point. What is interesting though is on the right hand side, being a brand new magazine, they wanted to let you know straight away exactly what the magazine was all about, and in fact they did it using a style of the 10 commandments. They gave 10 different reasons and explanations for why they were going to be completely independent and why they were going to be the best magazine to buy. Now I know what you're thinking, 10 commandments, isn't that a little bit religious? Should they really be putting that in a magazine? Well, the thing you got to remember is this was back in 1997 and being a Muslim hadn't been invented yet. Turning the page led you to the contents page. Basically, this is an overview of everything that you'll find in the magazine. It's kind of self-explanatory. What's kind of nice is the personal touch that they did introduce all of the staff that were working on the magazine. My personal favourite staff member for N64 magazine was Will Overton. He was the guy that did all of the artwork, including the incredible covers. The cover for this issue wasn't that interesting, however in the future he'd go on to create some of the best covers seen in magazines anywhere. Each issue of the magazine would start off with Future Look. This was your opportunity to see games that were in development or coming towards the end of development that were about to be released. In this episode they packed 4 pages, that's 2 double spreads, covering Star Fox 64. As you can see from the pictures, this game was going to be one that everybody wanted to get. What's also interesting is they started to mention for the first time the Rumble Pack. They weren't so sure whether it was going to be packed in and included with the game, and they even went as far as to talk about how much it was going to cost because they were so certain that it wasn't going to be included. The next 2 pages were all about The Legend of Zelda 64. What's interesting about this article is that even the writers themselves really didn't understand exactly how the game was going to work. And you can see from these early screenshots that things actually changed quite a bit during development, and the graphics were very early in the game's conception. But still, this gave us our very first look into what would become one of the most exciting and best-selling games for the Nintendo 64. Another game getting a double page spread was Blast Corps. This was one of Rare's earliest games for the Nintendo 64. When I first saw these pictures, I thought it looked interesting, but I wasn't as excited about some of the other games that they had already mentioned. However, when I saw this game on TV for the first time, it actually piqued my interest. I wasn't in a rush to get it, but at the same time I thought it looked interesting and it was something different that I hadn't seen on any other console, and it wasn't like anything else I'd played before. Planet 64 was the Nintendo 64 news centre. This was a roundup for how Nintendo was doing around the world and also a bit of news from other countries. Here in this very first issue they went onto the streets and they met the very first purchasers of the Nintendo 64 here in the UK, and they also went to Japan where they were surprised to find it was really quiet and retailers had been struggling to try and sell the systems. They also talked about how America was frenzied. They advised the different cables that were available to get the best picture from your Nintendo 64. And if you've watched any of my videos, I always record on S-Video, which they do recommend as being the best resolution. And also there's a really funny story about a grandma who was queuing outside to buy her grandson a Nintendo 64 on launch and ended up getting arrested for getting into a fight with another person as there was a mad frenzy and there weren't enough systems to go around. In this coming soon section they looked at 3 upcoming racing games, the first of which was Rev Limit. This was by Sata, which eventually went bankrupt, so this game never came out. And then there was Multi Racing Championship and Top Gear Rally. Both of these were early Nintendo 64 games, and to be honest neither were good as compared to some of the later games which would come out. Surprisingly for this issue there was no review for FIFA 64 because it actually came out a week or so after this magazine did. Fortunately though, the game was terrible and we didn't end up getting that one. Dynamite Soccer also gets a mention, as well as some very early screenshots for Yoshi's Island 64, which would go on to become Yoshi's Story. On the right hand side they talk about some software called Creation, where you'll be able to basically draw pictures and animate things using the ill-fated 64DD, and also a very brief and quick mention for San Francisco Rush as well. They crammed in 5 games over the next 2 pages, as you can see here. The very first look for Go-Go Troublemakers, which would go on to become Mischief Makers, Silicon Valley, which would go on to become Space Station Silicon Valley, and also Sonic Wings Assault, Wild Choppers, and Blade and Barrel. And finally for the previews there were looks at Robotech, Dark Rift and Dual Heroes, which were all games that were absolutely of no interest to me whatsoever, which is why I never got either 3 of these games whilst I owned a Nintendo 64. In RPG-loving Japan, the Nintendo 64 sales had stalled as everybody waited for the first big RPG, and Mother 3 was going to be that game. Unfortunately, as we know now, this game never came out, but they had a little bit more information about it. There was also a look at Crystal Stories, which would go on to become Holy Magic Century or Quest 64 if you're in the US. And on the right hand side we got our very first look at Mission Impossible. The anticipation for this game built up so much, I couldn't wait to play this game. Every issue of the magazine would also feature what they called the Ultra Release List. This was essentially a date of every single game that was in development, when it was going to come out in Japan, US and the UK. And also it'll let you know who was developing it as well. When I was a kid, this was essentially the Bible for me and my brother. Every single weekend we'd have a quick look at this list to see what games were coming out, and then we'd ring up our local game shop to find out if it was in stock. More times than not though, by the time we read this list the games had already been delayed, and probably delayed some more as well. N64 Arena was the review section for the magazine, and on this cover page it just lets you know which games they're going to be reviewing, and normally these were games that were coming out over the next month by the time the next issue would be released. It's strange to think about it, but this is probably the single biggest reason why many people decided to buy the very first issue of N64 magazine. It was their chance to get a great look, and also it was the first review in the UK of Super Mario 64. To be honest, this was a launch game that absolutely everybody wanted, so this was what everyone had been waiting for to see, to find out, and also to see if it really was as good as everybody was saying it was. When I first started to look at these pages, I literally could not believe it. My mind was blown. Seeing all of these pictures of Mario in 3D, looking at all of the different lands that you'd be able to go to, this was literally left me chomping at the bit to get my hands on a Nintendo 64. This review went into just so much depth about the game. It talked to you about each and every one of the courses, it gave you tips, it showed you photographs. There was no stone left unturned in this review, and also it probably helped that there weren't many games out at the time, so they really could donate so many pages for this game in this one magazine. In later editions of the magazine, when more games were coming out, it became harder, and sometimes the games that should have got more coverage, they just weren't covered in as much detail as they maybe should have been. Super Mario 64 would go on to be awarded a huge score of 96%, but anybody who's ever played the game knows this was truly deserved. This was one of the highest scoring Nintendo 64 games of all time, and even at the console's death, this score was still one of the highest. Absolutely incredible. Believe it or not though, Mario 64 was not the first Nintendo 64 game that I got to play. The Christmas that it came out, it was not one of the games that me and my brother were given by my mum and dad, but one of the first games that we did get was Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. This was a great game and it was a big difference because we'd already played it on the PC, but it was a lot easier to play it on the controller, and it also meant that we didn't have to pester my dad to use his PC when we had work to do. Whilst the game did have its faults, including absolutely terrible controls, the game was still fun and it gave you a chance to witness maybe the first steps of what true 3D gaming was going to be like on the Nintendo 64. The game only got 78%, but this was about fair, and I totally agree with this. After getting 4 Nintendo 64 games at Christmas, the very first game that we actually went out and got ourselves was Pilotwings 64. Both my brother and I were big fans of this game on the Super Nintendo, so getting to play it on the Nintendo 64 was a real bonus. Everything was more detailed, graphics were richer, and it's just a whole lot of fun to play. I have great memories of playing this game and trying to get all of the medals. In fact, I love it that much. If you check through my previous videos, you'll actually see that I have reviewed this game in the past as well. It got a score of 89%, which was very, very fair, perhaps a little generous. Next up we had a review for Turek Dinosaur Hunter. This was a game that everyone was speaking about because it was one of the first more mature, sort of directed towards the adult games that was released on the system itself. When I first looked at these pictures, I thought it looked absolutely fantastic. It had everything that I loved, from being able to kill dinosaurs and high-tech weaponry as well, and the story sounded pretty cool as well. In this review they actually give you details about which weapons to use on each levels as well, which was a nice touch. However, what was really disappointing was when I actually played this game, I found the controls to be really difficult to master, and also the graphics weren't the best. Whilst they were good when the characters themselves came up close towards the screen, the draw distance was really bad in this game. However, because it was a sort of jungle based sort of game, then the fogging wasn't too much of a bad thing. It got a score of 91%, which I think was extremely generous, and I actually think they reduced it in later issues of the magazine as well. If there was one thing about Nintendo 64 magazine that really used to annoy me, it was Import Arena. The reason why it annoyed me was because they'd review games well before they'd come out in the UK. Sometimes they'd actually review games which would never even come out over here at all, and there's nothing worse than seeing a great game and then finding out it was never going to come over in the UK. The first game that they reviewed is Mario Kart 64, which, as we know, was one of the best games for the system. They went into a lot of depth and talked about how great the multiplayer was, talked about all of the courses, the drivers, the different modes like time attack, and also the battle game as well. When this came out, we were really looking forward to getting this game, and I think we had to wait a good few months from this review coming out to when we could actually buy it. So this is why it used to annoy me, because it was a bit of a distance, especially when they gave it a score of 91%, which was really high. Unsurprisingly, Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey only got a score of 70%. The UK isn't a big ice hockey market, and to be honest, I'm not surprised they only donated half a page to this. But to be honest, I did play this game and it wasn't too bad. I remember reading this review for Killer Instinct Gold and I couldn't believe it only got 62%. I was a huge fan of this from the Super Nintendo, but the review actually points out that it's pretty much just an updated port, and to be honest, it didn't really add a whole lot and it could have been done on the Super Nintendo. So this was a little bit disappointing, and what's surprising is just how rare this game is to buy now, and also the prices recently have gone quite high on it, so if you do have a box complete copy, then get in touch because I'm still looking to get hold of this one. J-League Perfect Striker, or as it would be known in the UK, is International Superstar Soccer 64. This was a fantastic game. It got a score of 89%, making it the highest scoring sports game on the system at the time. And what's also interesting is when they did this review, they also went over to meet Team Major A, which were developing the game. So it's a nice touch to hear what they thought about the system. Mortal Kombat Trilogy, perhaps the first really truly terrible game on the Nintendo 64. This game could have been done on the Super Nintendo, it was that bad, and nothing about it spoke or looked about being next generation. The Glory of St Andrews was the first golf game for the Nintendo 64. Nothing about it really looked that technical or that detailed, so it only got a score of 58%. On the right hand side they paired it up with a review for Cruis'n USA, and they absolutely slated this game. Download the copy of this magazine and read it just for this article and this review, because it is actually quite funny. They gave it a score of 34%, and to be honest, I agree with that score. A few more obscure games here. Again, the reviews weren't great, so when I read these I really started to worry about buying Nintendo 64 games, because some of these reviews are truly bad. And also there's a big review for King of Baseball, which, to be honest, the UK is not a big baseball market, so this one's from Japan, where they probably absolutely love this. Tips Extra, as the name suggests, was the part of the magazine that featured tips, tricks and cheat codes for all of the latest games, and this was actually plugged and supported by the official Nintendo hotline. What's interesting is the official Nintendo hotline here in the UK was open from midday right the way through until 8 PM, so it wasn't actually open earlier in the morning, probably because they were too busy from playing games the night before. And what was also good was, in the days before the internet really took off, this was essentially what you needed if you were stuck, and you could actually write in and ask specific questions about different parts of games that you were stuck on. For example, here in this first issue, there's people asking 10 Super Mario 64 questions that they have been asked, and they give you the answer for them as well. And there's also some hotline tips as well for common questions that they have been asked on the hotline over the past month. The Club 64 part of the magazine was actually quite funny. Basically it's where people would write in, not necessarily the questions, sometimes it would be comments about the magazine or about the system, or about things that they saw in the future that they would like to see. The thing that makes this section really funny is the reply from some of the editors. They're not afraid to absolutely rip into some of the people that write in with stupid questions or begging them for games. So it is really funny, and it used to be one of the sections that I really used to look forward to reading. There was also a section called Dream On, where people would come up with ideas for games and write in and tell the editors what they thought would be a great game. In this first issue, someone's written in to say that they would like to see a World War I fighter pilot game, and also it gets a reply from Will, James and Tim, who are all part of the team working on the magazine itself, and there's also a little picture that has been sent in by the person who came up with the idea. A lot of the time these ideas were completely ridiculous and would never happen, but still it gave you an idea about how people were thinking at the time, and also some of the great ideas in later editions of the magazine would come out. Each issue of the magazine would feature the directory. Basically the directory is a summary of all games that have been released on the system up until that time. In this case there's only a few games available, so this list gets bigger over time. Like many kids, the very first thing that I wanted to do when I got my Nintendo 64 was to open it up and see everything that's just inside it. In this very first issue of the magazine, this is exactly what they did. Here you can see on the page, they let you know a little bit more about what you're going to be able to find. Then on this next page, they basically broke down all of the internal parts, all of the switches, the plugins, the controllers, and also they went over all of the expansion ports as well. When I read this I couldn't believe it, and I couldn't wait to get a 64DD. I was so excited to get it. Also they actually took the cover off and they went inside the actual console to let you know about everything inside, from the processor to the switches. Basically this is everything that you needed to know about the internal of the actual console itself. It was fantastic. They also went into more depth about the actual control, and surprisingly they actually told you how you can open up your console to play import games, which was a big thing at the time, but also it voided your warranty, so it was really surprising. It never would have happened in the official magazine. At the end of each issue of the magazine there's also the competition, which is exactly how I'm going to finish each of these episodes. Now, unlike N64 magazine, the prize for this episode is not going to be the ultimate night in. The prize is going to be a copy of Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, boxed and complete, and it's in good condition as well. I will point out that it is in the PAL region format, so if you are from around the world, just bear that in mind. And I'll also post it out to you wherever in the world you are, so this is open up to absolutely everybody. All you need to do is hit that like button just down below. Also leave a comment, let me know what your favourite part of the episode was, which game you remember that I've shown you, whether it's one like Mother 3 that never made it out, or maybe it's a game like Super Mario 64. Just let me know what you think about it. Also, to be in as a winner, you'll also need to hit the subscribe button. This will also let you know when my next episode is going to be available as well. The competition is open until I upload the next episode, which should be on the 1st of December, which is also my birthday. I would also like to thank the Out of Print archive, which is where I got all of these great scans from the actual magazine. If you want to go to the website, you can download N64 magazine as well as other magazines, all in print format. You can view it on your computer, on your iPad, any device that you've got, you should be able to read it on there. They've got lots of different types of magazines, and I've put a link in the description below that will take you straight there so you can start enjoying lots of these old retro magazines. Until next time, thank you for watching. Stay tuned for episode 2, which should be out shortly.